let's just at least go over 19b. Uh, we're going to keep going back to this Mishnah on 19b. So let's remember the Mishnah well. The Mishnah talked about machzelas konim. Machzelas konim means this mat of reeds. And the mat of reeds, the Mishnah talked about a large one and a small one. And it talked about also what the purpose is, if it's made, what it's made for. And the Mishnah was a little unclear. I mean, the ideas in the Mishnah seemed to emphasize that it depends what you make it for. If you made it for lying on, then it's considered susceptible to impurity. And we talked about what type of impurity, the impurity of medris. And we also spoke about if it's meant for sikoch, if you had in mind to build to make this mat for shade, then it's going to be kosher for schach because it's not tamei tumas medris. It's not used to lie on and to put one's weight on. It's meant for shade. So you have these two purposes of these type of mats. It's either meant to lie on or it's meant for shade. That's the way the Gemara seems to, at least in the time of the Gemara, it seems that's what the purpose of these mats were. And each of them carries with it a different rule based on the fact that it's either tamei tumas medris or it's not tamei tumas medris. It either becomes impure because one's weight is on it or not. And so what the Mishnah seemed to imply was that if you have in mind for lying on, it's not going to be kosher for schach. If you have in mind it's for shade, it is kosher for schach. And the question that the Gemara really was dealing with is, what happens if you had nothing in mind? You didn't designate it for any specific thing, and that was at least one way of understanding the Gemara, the Mishnah. The other way that the Rishonim explain it is not about you designating it, but more based on what the common use is. What is the common use of it? And that we spoke about yesterday, that seems to be the way the Rush learns, that it depends what is the common use for lying on, or is the common use for this, or is there no common use? And you could, people use it for whatever they want. It's not really, there's no minhag, there's no specific custom. Anyway, those are the two ways in the Rishonim how they deal with this type of these laws. But the Gemara's dealing with a different issue, and that is what happens if there is no common use, or if you don't designate it. That's what the Gemara is dealing with, because the Mishnah is vague. The Mishnah leaves that case to be implied from the other cases in the Mishnah. And the problem is, if you imply it from the other cases of the Mishnah, you actually come out with a contradiction, because from the first sentence in the Mishnah, it implies one way. From the second sentence of the Mishnah, implies another way. And then the question that the Gemara is dealing with as well is, what is Rabbi Eliezer's opinion about these mats? Because Rabbi Eliezer doesn't really say much different than the first opinion. All he adds in is something that to do with the fact that big ones and small ones are the same. So the problem is, in the first opinion, we didn't really talk about small ones. So the question is really, what is Rabbi Eliezer? What is he? He obviously is arguing, because his name is quoted there in the Mishnah. So it definitely sounds like he's arguing. What is he adding to this? What is he arguing about that the first opinion disagrees with? Okay, so the Gemara said, actually, I mean, it's up to you. Do you want me to read it inside from the Mishnah of the Gemara? Would that make it clear? It is a little like a back and forth discussion in the Gemara, because we're gonna constantly get back to the Mishnah and try to translate it different ways, 3 different ways. Should we go over it again? Anyone want to? Yeah, do you want to go over it inside? Do we do that? Yeah, David says yes. All right, I'm gonna let's do that. Let me read it inside. I'm gonna go a little faster than than I did, because a lot of you have it somewhat on, somewhat some of the clear. So let's
I'm going to go to my desk.
start from the Mishnah. Let's start from the Mishnah again, page 19b, and I'll try to do it. Try to go a little fast, so we'll cover some ground. Machzelas kanim gedola. When you have this large mat of reeds, also l'shchiva, if you made it, which means either you yourself made it or it was made, and you designated it for shchiva. It was sold and you bought it and designated it for shchiva, for lying on. So if that's the purpose of it, to lie on, then it's mekabelas tum. It's susceptible to tuma. What type of tum is it susceptible to? Susceptible to tumas medris, and ultimately, which means that it's sort of like a vessel, because it's used for you to put your weight on, to lie on. It's not kosher anymore for schach, and so that would be a clear law that these reeds, the large ones, if you had in mind to lie on it, it's not kosher for schach. Now, what happens l'sikoch if you had in mind for schach, to use for shade, masach and bud, then you can use it for schach. It's not susceptible to impurity. And we spoke yesterday about the fact that even though it's an oihel, and an oihel, actually the tent itself becomes impure, and not only the things under the tent become impure, so maybe it should be susceptible to impurity. And the answer we said yesterday was no, only things that are used in the Mishkan for the tent, that the Mishkan, the items that the Mishkan was made of, are susceptible to impurity, which basically means anything that grows from the ground. The only thing that grows from the ground that would be susceptible to impurity as a tent would be a flax or linen. And otherwise, these type of reeds would not be susceptible to that tuma either. So it's used for schach. If you had in mind to use this mat for schach, for roofing and shade, then it's not susceptible to impurity, and you can use it for schach. So that's the first opinion of the Mishnah. Again, we have a very vague, we don't have clarity as to what happens if you have nothing in mind. You did not designate it, or people don't designate it for things. It's just a mat that people use for all different types of things. And then the Mishnah didn't really talk about that. Now, Rabbi Eliezer says, achas katan, achas gedola, whether it's small, whether it's large. The first part of the Mishnah talk about large. Now, Rabbi Eliezer seems to mention about small and large, whether they're small, whether they're large. Also, l'shchiva makabels tuma vein masachin ba. If you made it for lying on, then it's susceptible to impurity, and you can't use it for schach. And that's what it boils down to, what you made it for. Now, it doesn't matter big or small. It matters what you made it for, which sounded like the first opinion in the Mishnah also said that if you made it for shchiva, for lying on, it's susceptible to tuma, and you can't use it for schach. Now, if you made it l'sikoch masakrin b'aveina makabos tuma, if you made it for shade, then or you designated it for shade, or people, or everyone uses it for that purpose, then you can use it for schach, and it is not susceptible to impurity, not to tumas medris, which is when person puts their weight on something and uses it regularly for a shear, for lying on, or for bedding, and it's not susceptible to that tuma. It's not susceptible to oihel tuma. It's not susceptible to a dead body touching it, that type of tuma, tumas mace. It's not susceptible to impurity. It's used for schach. It's kosher for schach. And that was the Mishnah. Now the Gemara is going to deal with all these problems that I just shared with you. Hagufa kasha, the Gemara says, this itself is contradictory, because the first sentence and the second sentence both imply opposite laws. In the first sentence of the Mishnah and the second sentence of the Mishnah. Again, we're on page 19b, and we are about 20 lines. Whoa. We're about 20 lines for the bottom of the page. Ha gufa kasha, the beginning of the Gemara. This itself is a contradiction. Amrit, you said asul l'shchiva. You said, meaning the Mishnah. Asal l'shchiva was made for lying on. So then mekabelas tum, it's susceptible to impurity, and which we said was tumas medris, the impurity of bedding. Now, of people putting their weight on something that would make it invalid for schach. So that means you had in mind to use it for lying on, but the ein mesachim ban you can't use for schach. Now, taima, the reason why it's not usable is because for schach is because the asal l'shchiva that you made it for lying on, therefore it's not kosher for schach. What happens if you didn't have that in mind? A hastama. What about a case where it's vague? It's not clear what you did not designate it for anything specific. So then it sounds like it's kosher. It's only when you designate it to lie on, it's a problem. It becomes susceptible to the impurity of person's body weight on something. But other than that, it should be kosher. So if you didn't designate it for lying on, then the hastama, it should be kosher. It's considered lasikoch. It's meant for shade, and therefore it should be kosher for schach. And what does the second sentence imply? The opposite. V'hadar tani, and then it learns the second sentence, lasikoch, that if you specifically designate it for shade, mesachin ba beinam kabos tuma, and then you can use it for schach, and it's not susceptible to impurity. It's kosher for schach because you had in mind for sikoch, and it sounds like only when you have in mind for schach is it kosher for schach. Time of the also the sikoch. The reason why it's kosher is because you had in mind for schach hastama l'shchiva. But if you don't have anything designated and it's just stam, it's just undesignated, or people don't necessarily use it for any specific purpose. So stama is l'shchiva. We assume that you're lying on it and it's invalid for schach. So the first sentence of the Mishnah implies anything stam that's not designated is kosher. The second sentence of the Mishnah implies anything that's undesignated is invalid. So we have a contradiction. Yes, David.
Does it go according to, what about what season it is? Because if it's around Sukkah's time, it could be designated for schach, but it's not around. It's the other 11 months of the year. Why would a person be designating this mat for schach? There's no,
because they used to hang out. They used to hang out outside, so they would use it for shade, not for the mitzvah of Sukkah, but for shade. Okay. So the Gemara says that this contradicts the fact that the first sentence and the second sentence implies a contradiction is not a problem. Holoi kasha, it's not a kasha because really they're two separate cases. And so the implications are correct as long as you understand that the first case is talking about large mats. In the second case is talking about small mats. And then you could say, well, large mats, if you do this, it's invalid. But if not, if it's undesignated, it's kosher. And small mats, normally, if you designate it for sikoch, it's kosher, but if not, it's normally going to be invalid. So in other words, now we'll separate the cases. We'll say they're two separate cases. So the Gemara answers seemingly a simple answer. It is a little surprising that the Mishnah doesn't say on the second case what it's talking about. The first case, it does say gedola. In the second case, it just says lasikoch. Now, initially, we wanted to say because they're both talking about for large mats. The Gemara's answer is no. First sentence, it says it's talking about large mats. Well, the second sentence doesn't say what it's talking about. We assumed initially it's talking about large mats. Now we're translating it. No, you know what? The second sentence is talking about small mats. And that's why you can have a different opposite conclusion because the second case is talking about a different type of case. So the first case, you have the undesignated law that's implied from the first case is if it's undesignated, it's kosher for schach. And that's because it's a large mat. A small mat, you have the implication from the second case that if it's undesignated, it's going to be invalid for schach. And we explained that that makes sense, actually, because when you have it small, what's the size of a small mat? It's the size of a person's body. So it does make sense that maybe that's what they're using it for. They're using it to lie on, and therefore it will be susceptible to impurity. And the impurity that it's susceptible for, the reason why it's susceptible is because it's used to lie on, and lying on has special laws of impurity. And therefore, even if it's not a vessel, it's flat like wood. Flat wood is normally not susceptible to impurity, but reeds that they're meant to lie on, something that's meant to be lied on, it will be susceptible to impurity and it'll be invalid for schach. However, if you did not designate it, if you did designate it, lasikoch, if you did designate it that it's used for shade, then it will actually be kosher. And that's what the Mishnah says. That if you designate it, it's going to be kosher. If you don't designate it, then you could use it. If you don't designate it, then it's going to be automatically invalid. If it's undesignated stoma, it's going to be invalid for schach. That would be the second case of the Mishnah. The implication from the second case of the Mishnah is small. So it's large or small. Now, I will mention to you, the Gemara is going to change from this answer soon. But in the end, the Gemara is going to go back to this answer. So we're going to, so this is in the end of the Gemara, in the conclusion of the Gemara does come back to explaining the Mishnah that there's a difference between a large mat, and that's the first half of the Mishnah, and the second case of the Mishnah is a small mat. But soon the Gemara is going to switch away from that, and at the end it'll come back to it. Now, the Gemara says that sounds good for the Tanakama, the first opinion. Now, what about Rebbe Eliezer? Now we got to translate Rebbe Eliezer. We now explained the first opinion of the Mishnah. We've got the first case talking about large mats, special law. Second case talking about small mats, special law there. And we know what the law is, what it implies, in case you don't designate it. And so now we're clear on the Tanakama. What does Rebbe Eliezer hold? So now we skip the parentheses, and now Rebbe Eliezer says, Achas katana v'achas gedola, whether it's small or whether it's large, also l'shchiva, whether if you make it for lying on, then it's mekabelas tumah, it's susceptible to impurity. Again, this is that tumas medrus that you lie on. So it's as if you made it for if you designated it for lying on, then of course it's not valid for schach. It's susceptible to impurity. Vein mesakin, but you can't use it for schach. And Rabbi Eliezer says that's the law about both, whether it's small or whether it's large. You designated it to lie on, that's it. It's invalid for schach. Now, taima also l'shchiva, and the reason why it's invalid is because you made it to lie on, hastama, but in a case that it's undesignated. So then we assume that it's not for shchiva, for lying on, and undesignated will be kosher, will be l'sikoch. You did it for, you had in mind for shade, and therefore it'll be kosher for stach. That would be the implication of Rabbi Eliezer's first sentence, that it's only if you designate it for shchiva, it's invalid. If you don't designate it, undesignated should be kosher. But then the second sentence of Rabbi Eliezer contradicts that. Ema seifa, now say the seifa, the end sentence of Rabbi Eliezer. Also, l'sikoch, if you make it for, if you designate it for shade, then masachin ba v'enam kabbalas tuma. You could use it for schach. It's not susceptible to impurity. It's only schach. It's not used to lie on. It's not susceptible to impurity. It's flat, trees, reeds. So that it should not be susceptible to. It's kosher for schach. You had in mind, you designated it for sikoch. It's kosher. Time of dasal sikoch. That implies that the reason is for this that because you made it for, you designated it for shade, and that's why it's kosher for schach. Hastama, but if it's undesignated, then we assume all mats are l'shchiva, are meant for lying, and therefore it's going to be invalid. So the problem is, though, it's a contradiction, because the first sentence implies that the undesignated mats, whether large or small, according to Rabbi Eliezer, if it's undesignated, the first sentence implies that it's kosher, and the second sentence implies that undesignated is not kosher. So that is a contradiction in Rabbi Eliezer, and we can't answer the difference that we just said in the Tanakama, that there's maybe a difference between a big one and a small one. You know why we can't say such a difference in Rabbi Eliezer? Because he clearly says, achas gedola v'achas katana, whether it's large or small. So he's not differentiating between large and small. So why do we have this contradiction in Rabbi Eliezer? So the Gemara answers, Elo Amar Rava. So Rava now wants to switch the original answer that we explained in the Tanakama, which we differentiated between a large mat and a small mat. We're going to switch that now to a new understanding. So what does Rava want to say? So Elo Amar Rava, rather Rava says that let's translate the Mishnah differently. And in a large mat, no one argues. The whole world, Kuli Alma means the whole world. Everyone agrees. They don't argue, they agree. The stoma is l'sikoch. A large mat, of course, is always meant for shade. No one's using it to lie on. You don't have such a large mat and to lie on it. No. It's meant for shade. That's what's for purposes. Key pligi, when do they argue? Only by a small mat is where they argue. By a large mat, everyone agrees. In Tanakama Savar, the first opinion in the Mishnah holds stam katana l'shchiva. The undesignated mat that's small we assume it's to lie on. Rabbi Eliezer argues, and he says, even though it's small and it's the size of a person, nevertheless, it's used for sikuch. That's what it's for. It's for shade. It's not meant to lie on. It's not if it's undesignated, we assume it's always for shade. That's the way Rabbi Eliezer understands that. That's the rule. And the Gemara now explains, and now we turn to page 28, and the Gemara explains that how do you learn the Mishnah now? So how does this fit in the Mishnah? So in other words, everyone's going to agree about a large mat. There's going to be a debate about a small mat. But a large mat, everyone agrees it's kosher for schach. And this is what the Mishnah means to say. The first sentence of the Mishnah, it says a reed mat that's large. Also, l'shriva, if you designated it to lie on, then okay, that has a special law. You designated it to lie on. It's not normally what it's used for, but you designated it that way. So makabelas tumah, it's susceptible to impurity. Vein masakhin ba, and you cannot use for schach. It's not valid for schach. It was designated for to lie on. It's tamei tumas medris. It's tamei it's impure with this impurity of putting one's weight on it because you designated to lie on. So you can't use it for schach. Now, taima dasa l'shchiva, and the reason, the implication is that you made it to lie on. So you designated it that way. That's why it's invalid. Hastama, but if it's stam, if it's not specifically designated, if it's undesignated, the nasik misha also l'sikoch. So the Mishnah says that that if otherwise it's l'sikoch, means we assume it's meant for sikoch if it's undesignated, and it's as if you made it specifically for shade, and you can use it for schach. So again, if you look back at the Mishnah, if you want to do a good job, you have to look back at the Mishnah and try to fit it into the words of the Mishnah. So to do that, you look back on page 19b and you read it in the Mishnah. Machzelas kanam gedoylu, you have this large reed mat. So asal l'shchiva, you made it and designated it to lie on. That's a special law that it's now mekabel's tumah. It's susceptible to impurity, and masach bein masachim ba, can't use it for schach. You designated it to lie on. You basically ruined it. You made it susceptible to impurity of bedris. Can't use it for schach. Now, what happens? What's the law if you didn't do that? You didn't designate it that way. So it's undesignated. Then we assume and we consider it the same as if you did it l'sikoch. That's the third line of the Mishnah. L'sikoch. Even if it's undesignated, never was designated. So then it's considered similar to l'sikoch. It's as if you made it specifically for shade, because we always assume that it's meant for shade. It's a large mat. It's meant for shade. And therefore, it's even if it's undesignated for shade, it's considered as if it's designated for shade, and therefore it's kosher for stach. You could use it for shade, and it's not susceptible to impurity. That's the first half of the Mishnah. We've now translated the Mishnah according to the way Rava wants to translate the Mishnah. This is the second answer of the Gemara. The first answer was the Gemara's answer, a difference of big or small mats. Now the Rava's answer is no, we're translating it to be that the Mishnah is all talking about a large mat, and the first case of the Mishnah is designated mat, and the second case of the Mishnah is undesignated mat. The undesignated mat is considered l'sikoch. Now, what would that imply about a small mat? What that implies about a small mat is that we assume the opposite. If this is the law about a big mat, it makes sense that a small mat is not going to fall into this category. And the reason is because the small mat is meant for one's body to lie on. So the undesignated large mat is kosher for schach. The undesignated small mat, the implication would be that the undesignated small mat would be invalid for schach because it's meant to lie on. That's what the implication would be from the first opinion. And now v'yasa Rabbi Eliezer, we skip the parentheses and we go to v'asa Rabbi Eliezer. L'meimar, Rabbi Eliezer comes and says, you say a small mat is assumed to be for the body to lie on, it's susceptible to impurity, it's invalid for schach. That's what you say. Also, Rebbe Lezer comes to say achas ketana v'achas gedoyla, whether it's small, whether it's large. Stama is kshera l'sikach. It's always the undesignated is kosher for schach. If it's undesignated, it's kosher for schach, even though it's small. So what it comes out, according to this, is that everyone agrees about a large mat, that it's assumed to be kosher. The question is a small mat. And the first opinion of the Mishnah is the Tanakama. He says the first Tana, he holds that a small mat is meant to lie on, and therefore any undesignated small mat is going to be invalid. Rebbe Eliezer says no, a small mat, even it's undesignated, it's kosher for schach. It's not meant to lie on. It's even a small mat is kosher for schach. So there's an argument on a small mat between the Tanakama and Rebbe Eliezer. Yes, David.
Isn't Lamemar one of the names of the rabbis?
No, Amemar. Amemar is the name of the rabbi.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, so that's so far that's where we're up to. Now Abaye has a problem, and Abaye's problem, you have to understand that he's going to be looking into the wording to try to make sure that this works, or maybe it doesn't work, and he's going to argue with this answer. And he's looking into the wording, the grammar. And what Abaye, at least the way Rashi understands this, is that when you say, let's say someone were to tell you that regular Coke is unhealthy, and the next person says, whether it's Diet Coke or whether it's regular Coke, they're both unhealthy. Is that the right way to word it? Or is the proper way to word it, whether it's regular Coke, whether it's Diet Coke, it's unhealthy? In other words, one person tells you regular Coke is unhealthy. The next guy comes along and he wants to say it's not only regular Coke, it's also Diet Coke. So what's the correct way to word that? Is the correct way to word that to say first the obvious, that you said regular Coke is unhealthy? Yes, regular Coke, whether it's regular or whether it's diet, it's unhealthy? Or is the correct way to word it would be to start with the Kiddush, both Diet Coke and regular Coke is unhealthy, whether it's Diet Coke or whether, so what's the correct way? So Rashi tells us, yeah. What do you want to say?
By going whether, it makes it more complicated. The sentence is really both. You're adding the word that I said, I have this also in the Davidson edition, that what they're saying is both. So both this and this are whatever. So then obviously you go with you repeat the first one first.
Uh-huh. So Isaac tells us that the norm, when you have such a dialogue, so the norm is to repeat the obvious first. And that's the way Rashi understands is the question of Abaye, that he says that if you want to learn it this way, it doesn't flow with Rebbe Eliezer's statement, because the way you're explaining it is that everyone agrees about a large mat, and there's a debate about a small mat. And Rebbe Eliezer is arguing about a small mat, and he wants to say that a small mat is going to be the same as the large mat. So according to Abaye, the way to word such a thing is that you should say whether it's a large mat, which is obvious, or whether it's a small mat, which you claim should be different, is really the same law, because it all boils down to the same thing. It's all about it's similar to a large mat. So the way Abaye says, you should really word this achas gedoyla v'achas katana. If the argument is on a katana, on a small mat, and everyone agrees on a large mat, and you want to say both this one and that one, the way you should word it is both the one that's obvious that we both agree on, which is the large mat, and the small mat should be both the large mat and the small mat should be the same law. And that's what Rabbi Eliezer is trying to get to, that it's always assumed to be kosher for schach. And we assume that you used it, that you made it, designated it for sikoch. That's the way it should word it. Now, if you look in the Mishnah, it words it the opposite way. So what Abaye is going to try to say is, you know what? Let's say the opposite. Let them argue on katana, on a small, let them all agree and not argue on a small one like we explained. He's going to say you have to do it the opposite way. Let them all agree on a small one, and then it'll flow better. Because if they all agree on a small mat and they argue on a large mat, then it makes sense to say achas katana v'achas gedola, whether it's a small mat or a large mat, a small mat that we both agree on, or a large mat that you seem to differentiate with, I say is the same law. So if you look in the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer, achas katana v'achas gedola, look at the way he words it, whether it's small or whether it's large. Now, the way Abaye is telling us the proper wording, it would make sense to say that they both agree on a katana, on a small mat, and they argue on a large mat. And then it would make sense to word it this way. Rabbi Eliezer says whether it's small, which we both agree on, which is obvious, or if it's large, I hold it's always also that it's considered to be made, but that it's considered to be that if it's undesignated, it's kosher. That's what I hold. That it's kosher. You know, something along, or it's non-kosher. The way Abaye is going to come up, say it is. They're gonna all be considered that it's non-kosher. The way Rava was saying it, he was explaining it the opposite way, that they're all considered like a large mat and they're all going to be valid for stuff. But that's what his question is. Now let's read it inside. So I've just given you the understanding of the way grammar works, at least in the Gemara, the way it's supposed to be. And Rashi gives examples how this is the norm. Tues has some other question. He has some questions. He says, but there are a few cases where it doesn't exactly do it that way. So Tues has some questions on it, but ultimately he says that in this scenario, this is the norm. This is the way it's supposed to be. So this is the simple understanding of the Gemara. And so now we're going to read it inside. Okay, don't answer it, okay? Next time, okay? Okay, so Abaye. Amalei Abaye. So Abaye says back to Rava that you gave a nice answer, except that it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit for two reasons. One is the reason we just explained, and then also there's a brisa that also doesn't fit with. So what is his statement? Amar le Abaye. So we're now about 8 lines from the top of the page. Amar le Abaye. Abaye says back to Rava, Ihachi, if so, what you're saying, that they both agree on a large mat, and on a small mat is where they argue. Ihachi, if so, Rabbi Eliezer, Omer achas katana b'achas gedola. The Mishnah that says that Rabbi Eliezer says whether it's small or whether it's large, it's achas gedola b'achas katana miboile. It should be the opposite order. Whether it's large, which is the obvious case we both agree on, and then you say b'achas gedola, or whether it's small, I hold that it should be the same law. But first you should mention the large one, because that's the one we all agree on, and then the small one. Miboile, it should say, if what you're saying is true, that the argument is on the small, but we both agree on the large, then the order of saying whether this or that should be whether the obvious one or whether the not obvious one, whether the large one and then whether the small one, and not the way the Mishnah says it, which is whether the small one first and then whether the large one. So the way you're explaining it doesn't fit with the wording of the Mishnah. That's the first question he asks. The oid, and additionally, he says, Ki pligi, when do they argue? Bigadoylahu deplete. They argue on a large one, not like you explained. that they argue on a small one, and Rabbi Eliezer is very lenient on a small one, not like you explained. No, when do they argue? They argue on the large one. Rabbi Eliezer l'chumra. Rabbi Eliezer is not lenient. He's l'chumra. He's more strict. They argue on a large one. And that's where the argument is. And then everything flows. The Tanya, because we learned in a brisa, machatzelas hakonim gedoyla mesakhin. A large mat. This is a brisa, similar to the Mishnah. It's a brisa. It says, it starts off with that case, with the similar case, machatzelas hakonim gedoyla, a large reed mat. Mesakhin ba, you can use it for schach. Right? That's the first opinion. That makes sense. That's the Tanakama's view. Regular, undesignated large mat, use it for schach. Rabbi Eliezer says, you can only use it for schach if it's clearly undesignated. It's not susceptible to impurity. Then you could use it. But otherwise, let me say that again. Rabbi Eliezer, let me just retract that. Okay, let me start again. The Tanya, we learned in the brisa, a large mat you can use for schach, undesignated, kosher for schach. No problem, it's large. It's large mat, it's meant for schach. Rabbi Eliezer says, if it's not susceptible to impurity because you designated it for shade, because you specifically, then it's mesakhin, but then you could use it for schach. But if it's undesignated, you can't use it for, even though it's large, you can't use it for schach, Rabbi Eliezer says. So Rabbi Eliezer is talking about a large mat, and he's prohibiting us from using it for schach if it's undesignated. If it's designated for shade, then fine. But otherwise, the norm, the regular case, the undesignated case, you can never use it for schach. Rabbi Eliezer is machmir, he's more strict. Not like the Tanakama that says the undesignated case is kosher for schach. Rabbi says no, that the undesignated, if it's large mat, it's undesignated, it's not kosher for schach. Now, what will they say? What will he say about a small one? Small one, they're all going to agree that a small mat is always going to be invalid unless you specifically designate it for something kosher, for shade. But always, if it's undesignated, it's always going to be invalid. A large mat, that's where you have an argument. So rather, Rav Papa now clarifies this idea that Abaye is developing. So Rav Papa then says, you know what? So this must be the explanation of the Mishnah, and it'll fit with the Brisa, and it'll fit with the wording of the Mishnah, that it starts out with Achas Ketana v'Achas Gedoyla. Everything will fit now, because they both agree about a small mat. When it's a small mat, the whole world doesn't argue. Everyone agrees. This small mat, it's meant to lie on. It's all, even undesignated, it's going to be invalid for schach. Where do they argue? They argue when it's a large mat. That's where there's an argument. Tanakama Savar, the first opinion of the Mishnah, holds that stam gedoylo sikuk, that the assumption, a stam, the undesignated large mat, is meant for shade, and therefore it's we consider it for shade. It's going to be kosher. And Rabbi Eliezer Savar, Rabbi Eliezer says no, stam gedoylo nami l'shchiva, that even a undesignated large mat, it's going to be meant for, we give it the law of that it's for lying on, and it's susceptible. Also, not only a small mat, but also a large.
Also, presumably, to lie on.
It's also not only a small mat. Is that what you meant? Not only a small mat, but even a large mat. According to Rabbi Eliezer, it's meant to lie on, and it's considered susceptible to impurity, and it's invalid for schach. So the Gemara says, okay, so how do we word the Mishnah? How do you fit that in the Mishnah? So it says, what does it mean if he designated it for lying on? He says, that Rabbi Eliezer says, it doesn't mean that he designated it for shchiva. This is what it means to say stam. The assumption is stam asiyasa. The just making it stam with undesignating it is nami l'shchiva. It's also for lying. Ad abed l'sikoch, until you make it for sikoch, until you
makes it for roofing.
Until you specifically designate it for shade. Even if you do it stam, it's going to be, even if you do it undesignated, it's going to be considered for lying on. It's invalid for schach, and it's only going to be kosher if you make it for sikoch. Now let's look back in the Mishnah.
Make a mat, you presume you're going to lie on it.
Presumably meant to lie on, even large.
Right.
Now let's look back in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah said, Machzeles konim gedoy. Let's look back in the Mishnah. So the way we're going to learn it now is that we're going back to the original way of understanding the Mishnah, that there's a difference between a large mat and a small mat, and both of them are talked about in the Mishnah. Machzeles konim gedoy, the large mat, also l'shchiva, if you specifically designated for shchiva, the Tanakama says you specifically designated to lie on, then it's susceptible to tumah. Makabel's tumah. Beina masakim ban, it's invalid for schach. L'sikoch. Now, if it's a small mat, so if you specifically designate a small mat l'sikoch for schach, it's besachim ba. You can use it. You could use it for schach, it's valid. It's not susceptible to impurity. So the first sentence was talking about a large mat. The second sentence is talking about a small mat. The first sentence implies that an undesignated large mat is going to be kosher. The second sentence implies that an undesignated small mat is going to be not kosher, invalid. That's the first half of the Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer says, Achas ketana, whether it's small mat, that we both agree upon that it's invalid for schach. Even if it's undesignated, it's invalid for schach by a small mat. That whether it's katana, which is the obvious case, or biachas gedoylo, whether it's the large mat, even the large mat I consider to be the same law. Also l'shchiva, that if you make it stam, also this is what the Gemara is explaining. How do you read these words? Also, l'shchiva. It doesn't mean you designate it for shchiva. It means if you make it, however you make it, we consider it as if you designated it l'shchiva, for lying on. We always consider a mat to be assumed to be for lying purposes. It's mekabelas tuma, and therefore it's susceptible to impurity. Bein masachin ba, you can't use it for schach unless you did it l'sikoch. If you did it specifically for schach, you designate it clearly for shade, then it's masakin ba beina makabel's tuma. Then you could use it for schach, and it's not susceptible to impurity, even according to Rabbi Eliezer. But the normal case, the regular case, the case where it's undesignated is always going to be invalid. And now everything seems to flow, and that's the meaning of the Mishnah. So we've now translated the Mishnah and completed that that discussion. Now it's not completely over because now we have a brisa. Okay, so but that sort of ends this way of answering the questions on the Mishnah and translating the Mishnah properly. Now comes the next brisa. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught in a brisa. Machzeles shel shifa, a machzeles. Let me just tell you where we are. We're about 20 lines up from the bottom of the page. Tanu Taf Reish stands for Tanu Rabbanan. The rabbis taught in a brisa, machzeles shel shifa, a mat of shifa. Now, shifa is not reeds. This is called rush. It's a different family of what?
He has papyrus. Papyrus or bulrushes.
Bulrush. Well, the way
that's the second one. The first one he has is papyrus, so it's almost like paper. It's what they use also for paper.
But what do they make papyrus from?
Reeds.
The way they seem to translate it, it's from the same family. I don't know if that's true or not. Of Rush, the Rush family.
Stuff that grew. Stuff that
I know.
By the riverside.
No, for sure grew. I don't know if it's the same family. I saw some translations that it's from the same family of Rush, but maybe not. It doesn't matter. Now, the thing is that these items are you have to understand that they're soft, and there's room to say that a person might use it to lie on. We'll soon see. Why I say that. But okay, so it's machzelas shel shifa v'shel gemi. Now, this machzelas, this mat that's made from these materials, which either is papyrus and gold rushes or just or different types of rushes. But these items, these mats, is gedoyla masaktin. If it's large, then you can use it for schach. It's meant for shade. Gatana in masaktin. If it's small, it's soft, and people will lie on it, and therefore you can't use it for schach. You can't. It's used for a mat to lie on, and it's tamei tumas medrus. It's tamei. It's susceptible to impurity. If it's something used for sitting and lying on, and therefore you can't use it for schach. That's these type of mats. Again, it's different than the Mishnah's case. Mordechai, do you want to say something? Okay. Now shalkanim. Now comes the case of reeds, a reeds mat, which is really we spoke about it in the Mishnah, in Vishal Chilas, and then another type of mat which is made from Chilas. And I saw one of the translations.
It's a reed. It's also a reed, but it's specifically used for weaving, for pleating, plating. It's not just a reed, but they make it's a weave of reeds going in different directions.
Okay. So I saw one translation as sedge. I don't know if that's a type of reed, but it's called sedge. But in any event, so you have this other type of mat, and the Brisa continues and says, and you have to be careful how to read this here, because the Brisa uses a very similar word that we've been using, but it actually has to be spelled a little. It has to be you have to pronounce it differently. This does not say gedoyla. This word is gedula. Gedula is masaktinba. If it is braided, then you could use it for schach. Because, and it doesn't matter even if it's small, even though it's a small mat, but because it's braided, guess what? It's not comfortable. This is, as it is, reeds are not that comfortable to lie on. And it's braided. So it's not going to be something that people are going to lie down on. And therefore, it's masakhin, but you can even use it for schach, even though it's small. It's not fit to lie on. It's braided. But aruga, so again, it's gedula or aruga here. The first case of the Mishnah of the Brisa spoke about gedoyla or ketana, either large or small.
That's
now we talk about gedu. What?
He has here.
Yeah.
I mean, he doesn't change it. He says gedoyla. Shel kanim v'shel chila. Chila is the woven mats. Now, because it's plating. Gedoyla, if the weave is big and therefore uncomfortable, mesachimbo, because people don't lie on it. Aruga, but if it's a very fine weave, so it's comfortable, ain't mesachimbo, then you can't use it for schach.
Where are you reading from?
I'm reading from the Davidson Gemara in Sefaria.
What's Davidson? Is that the Koran or the Schottenstein?
Yeah, I guess. I'm reading now from
Sefaria. So that's Sefaria.
And it says the William Davidson Talmud.
So that's the Sefaria. Okay. I am basing this on Rashi, and I did see there's a discussion about how the Rambam learns it. So there is another shot, but let's do it this way with the way I'm learning it. This is the way Rashi learns it, and because Rashi translates, if you look at Rashi, the second wide line, he says gedula maisei avos ukliya. He translates gedula to be maisei avos, a braid, and kliya, which seems like he's translating that. He's not just saying that it's well. I mean,
large, coarse.
Okay, I guess you could translate gedoyla that it's a large braid. I mean, it doesn't seem that that's what Rashi means. Rashi's translating gedula. Gedula means that it's braided.
Coarse. Doesn't Rashi use another word?
Uplia.
Uplia. So it's a coarse. It's not only whatever. I don't know.
No, it means a braid. Kliya means a braid.
Right.
Kliyas Cyrus. It
Right.
means a braid.
That's the question. Is the braid large and coarse, or is it a very fine weave? If it's large and
Right.
coarse, it's not typically used to lie on. If you're already going through the expense and everything of making it fine weave.
Okay. Anyway, I'm not
Shot
going to
on
learn it
reading.
that way.
I'm not arguing with you. I'm
Right.
open to the shut in.
I hear. I'm going to translate it this way, and we'll.
I
You
don't
know,
understand
we could always.
how you're reading it differently. How are you reading it differently?
Gedula means braided, like gedil on the tzitzis. Gedula, gedil, like from the word gedil.
So if it's braided,
If it's braided, then you can't lie on it. It's got to be too thick in certain areas. What? Gedula, then you could be masachek with it because it's not.
Then you can.
Then you can be masachek because it's not good to lie. You're not gonna. It's not comfortable to lie on. But aruga, if it's nicely woven, then ain't masachim, but you can't use it for schach because you're gonna lie on it. It's a mat that's gonna be lied on. It's so soft, even if it's large, you're gonna lie on it. And that's the point of this brisa, that whether it's small or large doesn't matter. This is a very soft material. So if it's gedula, if it's braided, then you're not gonna lie on it. Fine. But if it's nicely braided aruga, then ein masakin ba. You can't you can't use it for schach because it's meant to be lied on. Now, Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yishmael, and Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yossi, says in the name of his father, achazu b'yachazu, whether it's this or whether it's that, masakrin ba, you can use it for schach. Now, what are we going to translate achazu v'yachazu based on our previous understanding of grammar? Achazu, you could, whether it's gedula or whether it's aruga, Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yossi says you could be mesachech with it. You could use it for schach. He's lenient that it's meant for shade, and therefore you could use it for schach. Rabbi Yossi also says you could use this machzelas, that's aruga, this mat that's woven, or that's and obviously one that's gedula, that's braided. You could use these for shade. So whether it's gedula, whether it's braided, or whether it's woven, it's kosher for schach. So what we have here is a brisa that talks about the reeds, and it talks about a difference between if it's braided or if it's woven.